the issues affecting Asia's animals and the stories of the people working on their behalf. We'll be taking you on a tour of what's been happening lately in the animal protection space around Asia, and also bringing you updates from our huge network of animal protection organizations and our many working groups. Welcome to the Asia for Animals podcast.
Welcome to the new Asia for Animals podcast series, Asia's Wildlife Rescuers, where we will meet the incredible people creating a future for Asia's remarkable wildlife. My name is Elliot, and I'm the lead coordinator of the AFA Sanctuaries and Rescue Centres Coalition. In our very first episode, we meet Jess Hooper, founder of the brand new organisation, the Civet Project, an organisation dedicated to research, outreach, and the protection of civets. But what is a civet, and why should we care? Jess, welcome to the very first episode of the Asia for Animals podcast series, Asia's Wildlife Rescuers. And thank you so much for joining us today to talk all things civets.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Jess, I've had the immense privilege to work with a few different civet species in my time, from binturongs to large Indian civets, masked palm civets, and I've been really privileged to see the stunningly beautiful Alston's palm civets with my own eyes in Vietnam. But I take a guess and say not everyone who's listening may have heard of what a civet is before. So I want to pose the big question to you that was a giveaway in the title of this podcast. So, Jess, what is a civet and why should we care?
Okay, well, first of all, I love that question. So most people will only be familiar with civets through the products that they create, which is actually really sad. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But
I've got those questions lined up for you.
Okay, excellent, Brill. So civets are small nocturnal carnivores. They're actually the most ancient lineage of Feliformia, which is our cat-like carnivores. So they're really ancient.
I didn't think that.
Yeah, they're so ancient, and that's one of the things that drew me to studying them in the first place, because I was kind of thinking, how do so few people recognize what a civet, or I should say who a civet is, when they've been around for centuries. And so they are the most primitive of the cat-like animals. So they look a little bit like house cats. So they have very similar ways of walking. They have a long tail that they use to help them balance. Most civet species are arboreal, but you've just mentioned the Alston civets, and they're quite unique because they're an Asian species of civets that's actually terrestrial. And that's quite rare in Asia. So there's about 33 different species of vivarid, which is the family that civets belong to. And that includes civets, genets, oyans, linsang, and binturong.
Because civets are found not just in Asia, are they? They're also found right across the Indian subcontinent and into Africa, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So you can have civets in Africa, which are most commonly seen on game reserves. They like to keep themselves to themselves. Civets are notorious for being quite elusive, which is wonderful for them, a little bit difficult for researchers, because it means it's very difficult to trace them in the wild. And so we really lack that data and that understanding of what they're doing, what their role is for the environment, how many of them there are in the wild. And there's even debates as to how many species there are, because we don't have much genetic information about them.
Well, that's fascinating. So we're taking sort of a more specific look at Asia here. Could you tell us a bit more about the civets that you'd find in Asia, and just any cool and amazing facts you know about the civets that you find in Asia? You know, what they eat, what their habits are? Go ahead.
Sure. So I guess we'll start with the Ostens, because that's a species you've specifically mentioned as being really beautiful. They're exceptionally charismatic, and they're a bit of a flagship species for viverids in general, particularly Asian viverids, because they're one of the few species of civets that are listed as endangered. And there's also debate happening at the moment as to whether that listing should actually be upped to critically endangered. And that's because they are restricted to a very small area in Vietnam. And that area is now being very heavily poached. So there's a huge snaring crisis. And they are also being trafficked for things like the exotic pet trade, because they're very, very beautiful. So they are terrestrial. They are they have this really beautiful pelage coloration. So they have this kind of dappled coloration. So they have stripes and spots and a really, really long, slender nose. And that's perfect for them because they will be spending most of their time on the ground, which means as the light comes through, the dappled coloration makes them blend into the forest floor. So it can be really, really difficult to see them. Yeah. So they're primarily nocturnal, and they're very, very elusive. They have these really slender, long noses because they are insectivores, which again is quite unusual for civet species. Most civets, like our common palm civets, our masked palm civets, our small Indian civets, they tend to be more omnivorous. So they will catch small prey like rodents and carrion, and they'll also feed from a huge, huge variety of plant matter and fruits. So they're really integral as seed dispersers. So they disperse the seeds, but they also germinate seeds, and they can do so at much greater rates, both in the quantity and the types of seeds that they're able to germinate and travel with, than other species like other seed dispersers like macaques.
So that makes civets a really keystone species in their environments, and maybe a little bit underestimated in the effect they have on the forests around them.
Civets are unbelievably important for ecosystem health, because not only are they seed dispersers and seed germinators, but several species of civets, and I'm thinking particularly binturong here, they have a symbiotic relationship with the fig tree. And figs are an exceptionally important species for the environment and for ecosystems generally, because so many different species of wildlife rely on figs. But
Absolutely. If any of our listeners have ever been to like the subtropical rainforests of Asia, fig trees are such a dominant species there. And you see so many birds and primates and animals gravitating, like you think of the big hornbills you see across Asia. They're all going straight towards these fig trees to get their food and, during masting seasons.
And if fig trees were to disappear from those regions, you would see a cascading effect and you would see complete habitat collapse. So biodiversity is really hinging on these trees, and binturong in particular have a very specialized digestive tract, and they can travel quite far. So they're able to break down many different species of fig seeds that other species might be able to pass through their digestive tract, but they're not actually going to they're not going to germinate those seeds. So yeah, binturong are exceptionally important.
So just speaking on binturong for a second, because again, another strange name people may have never heard of before. Binturongs are these amazing, would I be right in saying they're the largest species of Veridae or the largest species of civets in the world?
That's correct, yeah. They're the largest. I always think of them, if you were to look at a two-seater sofa, a civet would stand on that sofa and its nose would be on one arm and its tail would be on the other. So they are huge.
huge. And when you think that these are arboreal species climbing through fig trees and stuff, it's crazy to think about. And for anyone who may be listening or not, who has never seen a binturong before, or more importantly, who may have never smelt a binturong before, they have a really distinctive smell, don't they, that people relate to stuff they might know in their day-to-day life.
So binturong are really famous for smelling like popcorn, and it's a very distinct buttery smell. And so they're quite popular in zoo exhibits because people can have a very sensory experience with them, because they're not just seeing these animals, they're also able to engage with their smell, which is a really unique experience.
Absolutely. For any, like you say, they smell like buttery popcorn, and for anyone listening, they actually literally smell like buttery popcorn. It's absolutely strange. And so there's a reason behind that. They have scent glands, right? That sort of emit this smell, or this is where this smell comes from.
Yeah, so one of the primary ways that civets in general, or I should say viverids in general, communicate is through the sense of smell. Most of them are solitary species, or very semi-solitary. So you might see that they will travel together if they're, in breeding season. But mostly they like to live on their own. So they're using their scent marking to communicate what their territories are, whether they're coming into season. And you find that particularly with binturong, you have a male and a female's territory will overlap very, very slightly. And that overlap, they'll only enter into at the same time when the female is receptive to mating. And so the only way that male is going to know that is if she's scent marking. But unfortunately, the scent that is excreted by civets has also been traditionally exploited. So in Africa, just to change tack, to change continent slightly, in Africa, the African civet has been farmed predominantly in Ethiopia for hundreds of years for the perfume industry. And they extract civetone, which is a anal musk, from their perennial glands. And you can squeeze that out and it smells absolutely atrocious. But it's one of those weird smells that you think is absolutely gross, but let me smell it again. And so it makes people come back to that smell. And so the perfume industry use it to enhance the smells, the nice floral scents of their perfumes, but also it makes the scent last longer. And so it's been traditionally exploited.
So changing tack a little bit, now that we've learned a little bit about how interesting and important civets are in their environments, what drew you to civets? I mean, you mentioned before briefly what did, but tell us about yourself and how you got to fall in love with civets and why you decided to help civets.
Well, my love affair with civets goes back to when I was an undergrad and I was studying animal science. And as part of the course, you had to do a student project. And I was very interested in animal behavior. And two binturong had recently come into a collection that I was doing some work experience at. And so the head zookeeper there asked if I'd be interested in doing a behavioural observational study on these two binturong, because at that time, and we are talking like 13 years ago now, but at that time, binturong weren't really that popular. Not many people had seen them, whereas now they're quite in vogue. They're the one kind of high-profile vivid species you'll see in zoos across the world. They are the most popular species in the zoo industry of civets. But at the time there wasn't that much known about them. So I was tasked with standing at their enclosure for about 7 hours a day for about 3 or 4 consecutive months.
The study of animal behavior is not as glorious as they make out, right? It's standing and watching a long time when animals are often just sitting there sleeping and not doing much.
Exactly. And I was restricted to the times of day when the zoo was open. So, and these are nocturnal animals.
How did that study turn out?
Well, I learned what not to do. But it did give me a lot of opportunity to just really, really focus on on this particular species, but because there was so little information known about them, I had to, for my literature review, I had to do a lot of research into other related species. And so I became very aware of the common palm civet, the masked palm civet, even the African civet. And one thing was really clear to me at that time was that my reference list was really small. There wasn't much information out there, and a lot of the studies that were published at that time were based on very fragmented information, or it was, surveys of other carnivores, and civet happened to have been documented, so it wasn't like there was anything specifically focusing on civet. And about the same time that I finished that project, there was a undercover BBC documentary, 15 minutes, aired after dinner time or whatever, and I just happened to have the TV on when it came on. And it was an undercover documentary that was exploring this booming industry of civet coffee. And the undercover journalists went and looked at civet coffee production, and they were filming inside these farms. And for those that aren't familiar with civet coffee, it's coffee that has been digested by civets. And the claim is that the unique digestive enzymes of the civet's digestive tract will strip the protein out of the coffee beans, which makes it a smoother coffee once you've cleaned it, hopefully, dried it, roasted it.
It's a very strange concept, right? It's very unusual. Where did this concept of feeding civets coffee beans come from? And for those who are listening, like, you may have not heard of the civet, but you may have heard of kopi luwak. That's the term for civet poo coffee, isn't it?
Yeah, so kopi luwak is the Indonesian translation for civet coffee. And it's said that it's from Indonesia is where the origin of civet coffee comes from. And it's a very colonial story in which the Dutch were in control of Indonesia at that time. So we're talking about 300 years ago. And that was also around the time that cash crops were becoming very important. And that's for international trade. And so the Dutch instructed the Indonesian people to grow coffee plants. Coffee hadn't been in Indonesia before that point, so the Dutch brought coffee plants with them. Indonesian people were then growing these plants, and they were curious by what these beans were. What is this drink? Why is this so important? But as the story goes, and I say this kind of loosely because the accounts that we have from that time are quite sparse, but it's a kind of marketing trope that is repeated even to this day, that the Indonesian people were forbidden by the Dutch colonizers to sample any of the coffee from the trees. And so the farmers started to notice that civets were coming into the plantations at night. They were sampling the ripest of coffee cherries, and then they were finding the scat of the civet in the forest, and then they were able to pick these pre-digested beans out of the feces. And then they started brewing the coffee from those beans, because those beans weren't going to be sold as the cash crop. And then, again, as the story goes, the Dutch colonizers realized that this kind of niche trade was happening. They sampled the coffee and they proclaimed that it was a much nicer coffee than non-digested coffee. And so it became a luxury consumable because of its rarity.
That's absolutely insane to think about. And I think a lot of people are very quick to judge and say, like, oh, this is traditional, or this is cultural, or this is something that's been happening for thousands of years. But really, this was a way for colonizers to make more money, essentially. So it's a misconception that this is something that's been around in Indonesia and around Asia for a really long time.
Exactly. And the thing that I found quite shocking on this undercover documentary was that they weren't showing civet coffee in the forests. What they were showing was these mass farms of civets being placed in these tiny little barren cages. still suffering from injuries that they endured when they were being caught in the wild. No veterinary care, no access to water, no nutrition, just being force-fed coffee. And whilst I was watching that very short clip on this undercover film, I noticed they kept saying the civets, the civets. But I saw 3 or 4 different species of civets there, and one of them were binturong. And I remember sitting there thinking, hang on, that's not even a common palm civet. So does everyone just think that all of these species are just civets? Is it a big civet, a little civet, a grey civet, a stripy civet? Like, these are independent species that have different trade restrictions, that have different conservation statuses, that have different dietary requirements. What is it about this species that people just assume they're all one? And so I became very interested in human civet interactions. And so it was at that point I started formulating ideas of where this research would go, because I was interested in how people perceived civets and how those perceptions then shaped the way we treated them, and how the way we treat them impacts their welfare and their conservation.
So seeing these binturongs that you studied previously during your undergrad, and then this chance moment of just turning to the TV and hearing this BBC, you said it from the BBC, right? This short news clip, this documentary has led you on your journey now to be helping civets everywhere and to raise the awareness of civets.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain moments in life that do change your thinking or change your journey. And it took me a long time to get to the point where I am today, where we've established a charity that's dedicated to tackling the civet coffee industry. You know, we've got lots of campaigns, we're bringing lots of people together, lots of NGOs are coming on board. But that's all happened very, very quickly. It was the formulating of this idea and letting it settle and trying to understand, how can I pursue this line of research? And at the time, if you wanted to study animals, you studied animal science. So you either went on to be a zookeeper or you went on to be a vet. And so the career prospects were quite limited. And it's only since anthropology and anthrozoology, so the study of human-animal interactions, has emerged in academia, that I was able to see exactly where my research interest fits and how I could look more specifically at that interface between humans and civets.
So we're just going to go back for 1 second. You mentioned a concept a few minutes ago where you talked about the snaring crisis that's happening across Southeast Asia and across many parts of the world, actually. Could you explain to our listeners what this snaring crisis is, and also some of the other threats that are facing civets across the world?
Yeah, sure. So the snaring crisis across Southeast Asia has been labelled by scientists as at epidemic proportions. There are a huge number of snares that are in the forest. And for those that aren't aware of what a snare is, it's a very simple, very effective, lethal and cruel device. It's essentially a wire loop, which when an animal walks through that loop, it tightens. And so animals get caught around the neck, they get caught around different limbs, around the stomach. And of course, when an animal is trapped, they struggle to try and free themselves. But all that does is simply tighten the snare. So not only do they suffer because they're being captured, but they suffer these very horrendous injuries because of the trapping method. It's a very...
Like it can be any animal. Like it's not just like they're targeting civets or any particular species. I mean, I worked with an elephant in Vietnam that walked into a snare and lost its front foot. Like these snares are totally indiscriminate and just capture anything that happens to walk through the forest, right?
That's one of the reasons why they're so cruel, because they're indiscriminate and because they're so cheap and easy to place into the environment. You can have animals that get captured and never get collected, because there's so many snares. So the animal's then relying on the poacher coming back.
It's just absolute, yeah, it's an absolute shame. And I think this is one of those really key points for many of our listeners of like, there is such a interplay with conservation and welfare. Like, not only are these animals being removed, like important civets being removed from the forest where they're playing such an essential part, but when you think about these individual animals, they're out there, they're suffering in the forest and may never get collected and sadly die quite a horrible death, or some animals break out of them and then have horrendous injuries for the rest of their life and infections, and then sadly basically succumb from them eventually.
That's exactly it. And so you think of the civets that you see in these farms, and you think how many other species and how many other individual animals were also caught at that same time, just in trying to get one civet.
Oh, it's just horrifying to think of it. And yeah, it really is an epidemic that everyone is talking about, because it's really just affecting so many species and driving so many species to the edge of extinction, especially across Southeast Asia.
That's exactly it. And one of the things that I'm very conscious of, being someone from, I'm from the UK, I'm very far removed from the areas that I study. One of the things that I try to always incorporate into my research and into my kind of campaign activities is the role of the consumer or the traveller, who might not live in these regions, but whose behaviour is fueling this industry. And I think it's really important to understand how we are each connected to different species of animals and ecosystems, even if those animals and ecosystems are existing on the other side of the planet. It's the images we're sharing online, it's the demand for exotic pets, it's the demand for tourist attractions where you can pose with the civet and you can feed it coffee. Those are the types of interactions that are fueling this crisis, and so everyone has a part to play.
Absolutely, because for some point, like, there is sustenance living and people are going to the forest and capturing animals potentially to feed themselves or their family. But actually this trade has become so big and so large, and it is driven by the demand of various different markets. And of course, many tourists that are visiting these areas and think, oh, kopi lukak, oh, civet poo coffee, this animal's crapped out a bean. This sounds like something wonderful to drink, and not actually understanding the ramifications of that single action of just trying a bit of coffee and leading back. And I mean, we see that across all our groups through the things that we see on our social media, etc., of various animals being caught and brought into captivity for farming, for pets, etc.
Exactly. And it's just, I think people just need to be very conscious of the ways that they're connected to other animals. And it can be as simple as liking a photograph and sharing your experience, or not leaving a negative review on, say, TripAdvisor or another review platform when you see animal cruelty, because you don't want to have your name associated with it. And so it's also about sharing those negative messages in order to share the positive hope that things can change if we were all to just be a bit more conscious of our actions.
Absolutely. So to move on a little bit, you have now started the Civet project. Could you tell us a bit about what this new project is hoping to aim, what its aims are, what it's hoping to achieve?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Civet project is a charitable foundation that was established last year. That's when we formally got our charity status. So we're very new. We're a small but mighty team, which makes us feel like civets.
Anyone who's listening who has been around a civet or hasn't been around a civet before, they can be ferocious little animals. Like, they've got some absolute fight in them, don't they?
Exactly. And we've got fight in us too, because we know that the issues we're tackling are very, very big. They're very complex, and they're going to take time and perseverance, but we're definitely here for that. So yeah, the Civet project came from my PhD research, which is in anthropology, looking at human-civet interactions. And originally it was just a website where I was sharing my research to a non-academic audience, because I was very conscious that it's all very well and good me writing scientific papers, but if it's only other scientists that are reading them, that doesn't inform tourists or consumers or the people that can have a positive impact. So I set up the Civet project just as a platform to kind of share what I was doing. But I ended up receiving lots of communication from NGOs, from animal sanctuaries, from different zoos, from a whole host of industries, of people collectively coming to me and saying, we need more information on these species, and we need more attention to be given to these species. And it became clear over time that, in fact, it became clear quite quickly, that there was a real thirst amongst the global community for more information and more recognition to be given to how wonderful these species are, but also the monumental threats that they're facing and the lack of protections that they are afforded. And so we established the Civet Project Foundation to specifically focus on vivid species. And our main focus at this time is the civet coffee industry.
So could you tell us a little bit about that? Now, you've said that it in inverted commas, originated in Indonesia, by the Dutch colonizers there. But this civet coffee now, like, I've been to many countries across Asia, and it's for sale in many places. How has it spread around Asia when it was something that colonizers essentially put into Indonesia?
So the spread of civet coffee is absolutely terrifying. It's, like you said, it started in Indonesia, and civet coffee tourism only really emerged in around 2007, 2008. So we're talking really, really recently. And it originated in Bali, which claims to be the home of civet coffee discovery. And the reason that it took so long, if you think about it being discovered 300 years ago, and then it took 300 years for people to start wanting to see it when they travel there. The reason it took so long is because it was due to popular media. So civet coffee featured in The Bucket List, the Hollywood film with Jack Nicholson and Morgan Freeman. It was featured on the Oprah Winfrey Show. This was all in the early 2000s. And not 5 years after those appearances, we see civet coffee tours popping up all over Bali, which is a huge tourist destination. And so the more popular that experience became, and the more economic advantage locals were seeing from that industry, the more it started to spread. But also, we then have the advent of social media and viral videos and Instagram, and people are constantly going out with their smartphones and they're sharing their experiences. And so essentially what's happened is places that have civets, and civets can quite easily be seen as farm pests or even urban pests, because they're very, very good at finding the easiest source of food. They're a bit like raccoons in that sense.
Absolutely. Just interrupt. Like, I've even seen, I remember very distinctly one of my first trips to Asia when I was quite young, was seeing civets under the Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. So they're extremely adaptable animals. And as you said, they're omnivorous and take a chance at anything, or many of the species.
That's exactly it. I mean, only last week, there was a news article in India. A very high-profile politician had proclaimed that civets were a menace because he wanted to he wanted to do some construction work to his massive house, and there was a civet living in the roof. And so he was kind of in this battle with the civet, trying to get the civet to move out so he could do these renovation works. And suddenly all of the news media is saying that these animals are pests and that they're causing issues. And so they get a bit of a bad name. And so, they can be driven out of places by humans. But then suddenly you've got this kind of demand for a product that only a civet can create. And so suddenly the civet is more valuable alive than it is dead, or it's more valuable alive and captured than it is kind of, placed back into the forest.
And so now that we're talking about that, as you said, like, if people are capturing these animals and essentially selling them to farms, potentially, understand wanting to make a bit of money for themselves, but the conditions on these farms are absolutely atrocious. And from reports that I've heard in the past, it's not just like a backyard hobbyist that may have 4 or 5 making a bit of money on the side. Like, these are huge commercial farms these days, aren't they, that are really leading into wildlife laundering and the illegal wildlife trade and things.
Yes. So a really, really monumental piece of research by Save Vietnam's Wildlife was published last year, and they surveyed over 50 civet coffee farms throughout the Dalat region of Vietnam. And they found that the facilities were being used as ghost facilities. And what that means is that the farmers, or some of the farmers, were saying they had, say, 30 civets, but actually they had 300. So on the face of it, you know, they're operating a legal business because they've got the permits, but they've only got permits for a handful of the civets that they actually have. And then, because like we said, the snaring is indiscriminate, if they were to catch civet species like Ocean civets, which can't make civet coffee because they don't eat coffee beans, they don't even eat much plant matter, but they're also highly, highly valuable as exotic pets or as luxury meat. But because they're endangered, they're not allowed to be captured. The civet coffee farm then becomes a facility that animal can be smuggled through. And so you end up with the legal wildlife trade and the illegal wildlife trade working hand in hand.
So I'll even admit, I've walked into a coffee farm in Bali before, and you know, it's disguised as, oh, here's all our coffee plantations growing, but to attract tourists in, they've had a couple civets sitting in a cage next to the restaurant. And when you're looking at these civets, like, and life looks horrible, and of course, like, you know, any animal without stimulation being kept in a cage, they're chewing at their own tails, they're chewing at their own feet, they're losing their hair. Like, can you describe some of the conditions on these farms for these poor animals?
The conditions really are horrific. And yeah, so you're exactly right that they have these horrific injuries. Many will be missing limbs. So I've seen civets missing their front feet where they've been caught in a snare. The most common injury I've observed is civets missing tails. And that's because they get so stressed that they gnaw through the bone. And so they lose their tail. And then the other really common injury is missing ears. And that's because civets can be housed together, but civets are solitary. So they will fight. And so you end up with civets that have these, missing ears or missing parts of their ears. Missing fur is really common where they're trying to overgroom. And the thing that I was most shocked by, actually, when we did our recent surveys, was the lack of biosecurity. And given that tourists are actually encouraged to handle the coffee beans after they've passed through the civet, and you can have like display cases with the civet feces with the coffee beans in it. And it's like, so tourists are being encouraged to get really close and personal with civet excrement, which is just a biohazard in itself. But then the facilities that the animals are housed in are really dirty as well. So civets are often sitting in their own filth. And I went to a facility where there was civets that were sat in a pile of feces so large that I at first thought it was another civet. And it wasn't until I got close, I could see that it was furry with mold. And so these animals are just in these awful conditions. We had to throw away our shoes after one visit because we, as a visiting tourist, were walking through urine.
And I mean, just coming out of COVID-19 and the potential wild animal implications that come from that, like, this is a huge, huge potential source for another pandemic or another health issue.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it puts the local people at significant risk. And the other issue you have to realize as well is that a lot of these civets are being transported over vast distances. So if you have a disease in one population, you're then moving animals out of that disease population and bringing them into a captive environment where they're interacting with humans from all over the world. You know, a cold to one tourist could be a death sentence to a caged civet that's already immunosuppressed because it's so stressed. the disease implications are astonishing. And it's really shocking to think that this industry has been mainstream for about 20 odd years now, and it hasn't received the attention it needs purely on a biosecurity level.
And so we're talking about, like, in some cases, like, these places, you said, like, they essentially legally operate. Like, like wildlife farming is becoming a larger thing all around the world for niche products, such as kopi lukak. What laws and regulations are guiding these animals in captivity, or guiding the farmers, or whatever? And I mean, we're talking broadly across many jurisdictions around the world, and especially in Asia, so it's hard to speak across an entire region. But are there laws within countries that help control this, look at biosecurity, look at animal welfare, or is this sort of an industry that's operating on the fringe?
I would say it started by operating on the fringe, but that's certainly not the case now. So civet farming for meat, so restaurants will frequently sell civet meat, and civet coffee is huge. And like you said, these are warehouse operations. They are scalable. So the more civets you have, and the more cages you have, and the smaller the cages are, the more you can fit in, the more profit you're going to make. And a wild civet costs about £10. So we're seeing it was about $6 US for a live civet, and a cup of coffee is $50.
Well, so there's a huge profit margin in it. And I'd imagine that a lot of these animals, like that, you often hear these industries are sustainable, again, in inverted commas, because they're breeding these animals in captivity. But under the conditions that you're describing, would not be conducive for any sustainable industry to breed these animals for the vast numbers that we're talking about for this trade. So presumably, going back to the snaring crisis and capturing from the wild, all these animals are essentially wild source, right?
Yeah, most civets that you find in civet coffee facilities are wild sourced. There are cases of civet breeding for meat and for the pet trade, but it's really difficult to breed civets because, like you say, those conditions just aren't conducive to successful reproduction. So the labor and the time and the resources that you have to put in to get a litter just isn't worth it when you could get those civets for not very much money from the wild. But in answer to your question with the protections and the status, the easiest way to approach this issue of why is it that so many civets can be taken from the wild, and how is it that civet coffee can be a legal enterprise? And that comes down to the fact that the most popular species that is extracted from the wild for kopi lukak, civet coffee, is common palm civets. And they're not listed as vulnerable to extinction. They're not listed as endangered. They don't appear on the IUCN Red List. They're not restricted in kind of international legislations as to how many animals should be traded. So it falls to the local level. So the local, like in-country councils and things, to set quotas for how many animals they think can be sustainably harvested. But what researchers have found, particularly in Indonesia where kopi lukak is prevalent, is that there are more civets in captivity openly on sale in wildlife markets than there are quotas available for wild harvest. So
Wow.
It's not just the fact that these animals are really poorly protected by law, it's also that any laws that are put in place or any permits or quotas are simply ignored because they're not enforced.
Well, and is there any research to say how the common palm civet, I think you just said, was harvested from the wild? Is there any research about how they're doing in the wild? They're listed as least concern at the moment, or not even listed in many places. Is there evidence to suggest that they're becoming rarer in the wild, further enforcing that this is a completely unsustainable practice?
Unfortunately, no. Because they are nocturnal and fairly elusive in the wild. So, for example, they have day nests that they like to sleep in. So when researchers are going to be active in the day and can see up into the canopy, the way that civets nest make them invisible. So they will choose trees that have really big mats of vines, and then they will nestle in the vines. So from the floor, you really cannot see them. So getting population estimates for common palm civets is really hard. And then you also have the flip side of that, in that they are very adaptable to anthropogenic activity. They will venture into urban environments. And so there's a misconception that these animals are thriving because there's, we see them on a nightly basis because I hear them running across my roof, for example. And that's not necessarily to say that these animals are able to thrive in urban environments. It might just be that the environments are so fragmented that they're actually traveling to different forest fragments on the roads that have been ploughed through them.
Wow. And so all this research has led you up to, so let's announce it now. April 4th is going to be World Civet Day, spearheaded by your new organization, the Civet Project. And you're launching a documentary on that day that's looking into some of the issues that we've just discussed. Do you want to have a chat about, maybe not reveal the big ending, but tell us what this documentary is looking at? Because you did sort of some investigations of the farms and people across Asia and stuff, right?
Yeah. So I'm really, really excited about this. So World Civet Day is taking place on the 4th of April, which is a very important day for civets because it's the anniversary of the date that the conservation agreement was signed for the Austin civet. And so we wanted it to have a meaning behind it. So the documentary, which is called Civet Coffee From Rare to Reckless, is an expose documentary about the story of civet coffee, but we try to bring civets in as the kind of lead protagonist because so much of the narrative surrounding civet coffee actually pushes civets out of the picture, and it focuses on their poo and it focuses on the coffee. And so we wanted to show how wonderful civets are and how valuable they are, and that intrinsic value of each individual animal. But we wanted to highlight how the marketing claims of civet coffee, which is the reason why this product is so successful and why it's been able to be scalable across Southeast Asia, how these claims are founded on fabrication. Like the marketing claims that it's rare isn't true. It's not unique. It's not even the most expensive coffee in the world anymore. So we're trying to explain through the documentary that this industry has huge implications for animal welfare, conservation, human health, but that tourists and consumers have the power to make different choices. And those different choices can really help improve the lives of animals.
Speaking of anthropogenic studies, have you talked to the people that are operating these farms and who may be working in this industry? Because I presume by the sound of the scale, it actually provides a lot of jobs to people in potentially rural areas. Is there implications for the human side of things if we're raising awareness about this?
Yeah, so it's really tricky, and that's why I was very interested in studying this phenomenon through the discipline of anthropology, because I am very aware that there are perceived to be benefits to this industry, because it is, like you say, bringing people jobs, it's bringing people income. And so it's how do you advocate for the animal whilst not demonizing the people involved. And all of our research in the last 5 years has concluded that people and travelers want to see culture. They want to see natural environments and nature. They want to see the immersive landscapes. They don't necessarily want to see the civets. And so they're interested in how coffee is traditionally brewed in different places. They're interested in trying coffee. Most people actually talk more about the experience of seeing a coffee cherry than they do the civet. And that's because most people only ever see a coffee bean, and they only ever see it once it's been roasted.
Yep.
So to actually see the product they interact with on a daily basis in its natural form is really educational, it's really interesting, it's really engaging. And so if you were to simply take the civet out of that picture, you're not going to impact someone's livelihood. You just make it better for the animal.
I just want to touch back on the animal again, and them actually eating and digesting this coffee bean. I've heard stories where, like, essentially, maybe not force fed, but the coffee fruit, or what do you call it, the coffee fruit with the beans inside. They're essentially, that's the only option they're given to eat, which must be horrendous with being such an omnivorous species.
So caffeine toxicity can lead to death, and it frequently does with civets. And this is another thing that I try to explain to people when they're curious about civet coffee. And I always start by asking someone, do you drink coffee? Most people will say yes. I say, right,
yes,
okay.
I absolutely do every single morning. I can't survive without it.
Okay, so let's do this with you then. So you rely on your coffee in the morning. So do I. So do millions and millions of people across the world. So how many cups of coffee would you have in a day?
Oh, let's not say this too much. Let's say 2, but believe me, it's a few more than that.
Okay, and when do you have your last cup of coffee in the day?
I would like to say early in the day so I can sleep well, but often late in the day.
Right, sure. Let's say most people would try to curb their coffee consumption in late afternoon because they don't want to be up at night. Okay, so let's say that you have 2 cups of coffee a day. What if I doubled that and said, okay, but you have to have 4 cups of coffee today? Are you going to feel much different?
Oh, I'd have the jitters completely.
What if I said you had to have 8 cups?
I don't think anyone would want to be around me.
20 cups?
I can already see where this is going. This is horrendous.
You'd feel physically sick. You'd be physically sick. You would you'd have hallucinations are common with caffeine toxicity. You become to shake, you convulse, you can see things that aren't really there. You get exceptionally tetchy. So you're going to be more argumentative. You're going to feel more sensitive, both physically, emotionally. And so in this scenario, I'm giving you this much coffee and you feel pretty rubbish right now. And then I'm going to tell you, you're not allowed to drink any water and you're not going to have any food.
Wow.
You're not going to live very long.
Absolutely not at that rate. And so they really are just given the bean to eat, digest, and crap out essentially, and no other nutrition. So not only coffee toxicity, but they just wouldn't survive nutritionally.
No, and then what happens is civets kind of have to make a choice. They either continue eating the coffee that's making them die, or they starve themselves to death and refuse to eat it. And so one of the things that we were finding in our surveys is that civets in these farms where they had stopped eating the coffee beans, the owners would then give them other foods to try and encourage them to eat the coffee beans. So they would give them banana, was a really common one, and chicken broth. And so what you find is this weird kind of, this weird dichotomy where you have really malnourished civets that look on the brink of death. And then you've got morbidly obese civets as well. And the obese civets have really bad health, but they have bad health because they've carried on refusing to eat the coffee. And so the farmers are still giving them the high sugar fruit, which is just making them fat.
To try and keep them alive in the hope that they'll eat coffee beans again one day.
Yeah.
Oh, that's absolutely horrendous. So your documentary is looking at the entire process from the civet's point of view and the challenges, while also touching on the anthropomorphic factors that are associated with this industry. It sounds like an incredible expose, essentially, that hasn't received a lot of in-depth attention like this. So I'm sure all our listeners really want to know where they'll be able to see this documentary and when they'll be able to see this documentary.
Yeah, so we are launching the documentary on World Civet Day, and we are issuing it completely for free to universities, colleges, community groups, zoos. So we have a two-pronged approach. We have a launch event taking place on the 4th of April, and it's going to be a virtual event. And we're asking, universities, colleges, and community centres, reading groups, that type of thing, to sign up. And then there will be a live Q&A, an introductory talk. Then we'll all watch the documentary, and then we'll all meet back online to have some final discussions. That's happening on World Civet Day. World Civet Day presented a slight issue for us here in the UK because universities and colleges go on a 2-week Easter break. And so their facilities will be closed during World Civet Day. So in the UK, we have screening events taking place in zoos that have civets in their collections and who are contributing to proper welfare and conservation practices. And we are also hosting a series of in-person screenings in Asia and the UK and Europe throughout 2024.
Amazing. And you've already shared with us a bunch of details here at Asia for Animals, and we've shared that with many sanctuaries and rescue centres across Asia. So hopefully this will be flooded right across social media. But anyone who wants to see that documentary can come to the Asia for Animals website, to our social media, and you'll be able to find a link to this documentary and to learn about it and share it with all your friends and family, so that when they go on their little tour to Bali, that this is something that shouldn't be included on their itinerary. Now, Jess, we've talked a little bit about some very, very confronting things about suffering civets today. Do you have any beautiful, uplifting anecdotes or beautiful observations you've made of civets during your career or studying civets?
I'd say the most humbling experience I have when I teach people who previously didn't know what civets were is that when I tell them how many species of civets there are, and, all the different color variations and how secretive and elusive and kind of mystical they are, everyone I talk to just seems to be overcome with wonder and awe and surprise that this is a really ancient species of animals that they had never known of before. And so through the Civet project, we're really here to inspire empathy and appreciation for those less well-known species, those species that aren't listed as endangered and so don't get much kind of conservation support. It's just been really lovely to see this global community of people come together and say, yeah, we want to help. Like, we couldn't have done this documentary without so many different organizations and so many different people. We really are privileged to have so many people come on board.
That's so amazing to hear that so many people are caring about civets. And I hope that anyone who's listening who hasn't Googled binturong or civet yet, to Google and look at the diversity of these amazing species. And I mean, I've been privileged to work with, various species of civets in sanctuaries and rescue centres, seeing them in the middle of Kuala Lumpur, or when you're out on a spotlighting tour in a national park. There's just something about catching them, and they are, as you said, they're mysterious. They're just such stunningly beautiful little creatures that sadly don't get enough attention as we've raised today. And I hope that everyone will get to either Google a civet or maybe one day get to smell a binturong in an ethical way, to come across a binturong somewhere, because it's just such an absolutely strange and bizarre smell. It's like you walked into the cinema, really, like it's crazy. To finish us off, Jess, what are the very, very key takeaways that anyone listening today can do to help civets?
So I would say that always remember that as a consumer and a traveller, you have power, you have a voice, and it's really important to speak up. So we will be launching a petition as part of our documentary and as part of World Civet Day, which is asking TripAdvisor, as the largest review site in the world, to make sure that they list every single civet coffee attraction on their platform as in breach of their own animal welfare policy. Because at the moment, not all civet coffee attractions are listed as in breach of their animal welfare policy. And so without giving a warning, an animal welfare warning to travellers are unwittingly contributing to this practice. And so there will be an opportunity to sign that petition from World Civet Day. So I would encourage everyone to do that if you can. And I would also say that if you are a traveller in the future and you stumble across animal welfare issues, regardless of the species, use your voice, speak up, tell your tour operator that tourists don't want to see this type of abuse, and always leave a review, because reviews help to inform not only future travellers from making the same mistake, but it also alerts the platform that they need to do a review as to whether they should be promoting that practice as well.
That seems like such a simple and easy to do thing that we can all do to help civets out. Jess, thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like if people didn't know what a civet was before, they've definitely fallen in love with civets now. So for everyone listening at home, if you haven't already fallen in love with civets, if you haven't Googled civets, you've now got a really good opportunity to help civets through those actions that Jess just shared with us. So Jess, thank you so much for sharing all that insight, for sharing your passion and being one of Asia's wildlife rescuers. Jess Hooper from the Civet Project. Everyone celebrate World Civet Day, April 4th. Look out on, what's your website and social media handles?
www.thecivetproject.com, and we are at the Civet Project on all socials.
Amazing. And on April 4th, you can also see all these details on Asia for Animals social media followings and on our website. So Jess, thank you so much again for coming and speaking to us and sharing what amazing creatures civets are. And I hope everyone now knows what they are and falls in love with them too. So thank you very much, Jess.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. You can find everything you need to know about our work and connect with us at asiaforanimals.com. Tune in for the next episode. Asia for Animals Coalition, a united voice for Asia's animals.